Hi and welcome to today's live chapter reading of Irresistible Christmas Anthology. The first book is Two Hearts Christmas Rescue by Tamara Ferguson. Prologue, December 3rd. His mouth gaped open. Sergeant Jake Ryder sat across from Commander John Drummond, who'd flown in from Texas to meet Jake personally, since Jake had just returned from Afghanistan the day before. The commander's words had left Jake in shock. Finally, Jake was able to regroup. "Excuse my language, sir, but how in the hell was Brian Darnell able to escape?" The commander stared at Jake with concern. "The details explained to me by different few officers are somewhat vague. Apparently, there were orders presented for his release. Someone put it out that he was working for a foe." "He definitely had to have been conspiring with someone else in high command," Jake stated grimly. The commander heaved a sigh, nodding his agreement. "There's no doubt in my mind. And it can't be a coincidence that it happened right before he was supposed to go on trial. We tried to rush him through a court-martial as quickly as we could, but I agree. We've been able to keep it quiet, so someone on the inside had to have been behind his supposed accidental release." Jake closed his eyes, counting to 10 beneath his breath, and then opened his eyes again. "So I take it that you need me back on his trail?" "I hate to have to assign you to something like this right before Christmas, but I feel it's imperative to get Darnell back in custody, and no one seems to know him any better than you. Every lead I've obtained about his whereabouts has led me to nowhere." "As you know, Christmas isn't exactly my favourite time of year," Jake answered derisively. "I'd welcome the diversion." Commander Drummond stared at him intently and finally nodded his acceptance. "All right," the commander murmured. "Let's work out the details. I'm afraid this is going to have to stay between the two of us for obvious reasons. If I hadn't got a call from one of my operatives who was working here in the area, I would never have even known that Darnell had been released." When Jake had taken Darnell into custody 2 months earlier in Crystal Rock, Wisconsin, he'd flown back with him here to Quantico, where Darnell had been held in the brig awaiting his probable court-martial, as all the evidence against him was being compiled in order to make sure they had as close to an airtight case against him as possible. A few hours later, Jake was on his way to his condo, where he'd try and get caught up in laundry and start packing for his cross-country trek, which he would begin tomorrow. He'd physically follow all the leads that the commander had obtained, although Jake had a feeling that he knew Darnell's destination. It amazed him how Darnell had managed to avoid detection when Jake had been tracking him earlier this year, and he suspected there was a private plane at Darnell's disposal, even though Jake had been unable to locate anything other than a truck in Darnell's name. But if Darnell wasn't working alone, it was starting to make more sense. It was frustrating for Jake that after watching nearly every move Darnell had made and finally succeeded at taking him into custody, Jake had to start all over again. Even though the charges are still in contention, there had been a long list of witnesses that would need to be lined up for Darnell's court-martial. Darnell had somehow managed to weasel out of the previous charges against him 1 year earlier, and had been granted early retirement instead. But Darnell had sworn revenge against Jake after being taken into custody for the second time in Crystal Rock, Wisconsin a few months earlier. But what no one knew. Although he couldn't prove it, Jake was sure that Brian Darnell had been responsible for the rape and murder of his younger sister at Christmas 5 years earlier, and Jake had vowed that no matter how difficult it was going to be to get him convicted, Darnell would pay for every single thing he had done. Chapter 1, 2 days later, Crystal Rock, Wisconsin. Where in the world did this guy come from? He's the size of a small pony. Veterinarian Kinley Mathis studied the massive dog, who seemed to be staring at her lovingly from inside the largest cage available at the Crystal Rock Animal Shelter. Obviously realising she was talking about him, the dog started wagging his tail like crazy as he stood expectantly and began to whine. Rose Atkinson grimaced. Dad brought him in. Supposedly he was wandering around the beach near his house. Kinley smiled widely. So how many animals have shown up on your doorstep through the years? Rose grinned. Too many to count. I suspect that Dad doesn't mention half of them to Mum anymore. The Atkinsons were rather an amazing family. Rose's mum, Emily Richardson, was a Grammy Award-winning vocalist who had settled in Crystal Rock with her husband Tim, a former Air Force veteran and service dog trainer who had taken over the running of the shelter when he'd returned home as a wounded warrior. Tim's idea had been to turn strays into service animals for people with disabilities, and the programme had been highly successful. Rose had come into the picture as a young disabled girl who'd been blinded in a car accident where she'd lost her parents, and Emily and Tim had ended up adopting Rose when they'd fallen in love with a 6-year-old girl who had needed a service animal. I'm surprised you're back in Crystal Rock already. Aren't you and Ben usually touring until Christmas? Rose suddenly looked flustered. Kinley gave her a wry smile. Okay, what's going on? You've been acting distracted the entire week. I was going to wait to announce it at the Christmas charity event, but since you're already like a member of the family anyway. You're pregnant, aren't you? Rose blinked. How did you know? It's written all over your face, Kinley admitted, reaching over and pulling her into her arms. I've seen my share of pregnancies in my day since my dad was an obstetrician. Rose reached for Kinley's hand as they pulled apart. I have such an amazing life, but I still think of my birth parents all the time. Yes, the holidays can be pretty rough, Kinley confessed. I can't believe it's been 10 years now since my mum and dad were killed in that plane crash right before Christmas. Rose was misty-eyed. At the time I lost my parents, I was too young to realise how lucky I was to be adopted by Emily and Tim, especially considering my disability. That's something I'm worried about, you know. Even though the blindness was initially caused by the car accident, apparently, there's a good chance it is going to happen anyway because I was predisposed genetically. And now there's my baby. Don't worry, Rose. Think about how many advances have been made in the optometry field. Look how well that corrective operation worked for you. It's been what, nearly 10 years, you said? Rose looked thoughtful. Yes, it's hard to believe it's been that long. Although there's a chance that the results aren't permanent. Even though my vision has never been 100%, I haven't noticed any loss, and neither had the doctors. Well, there you go, Kinley murmured. I have a feeling the only thing you and Ben will have to worry about is the amount of talent your kid will inherit from the two of you. Rose pursed her lips. It was kind of funny how I ended up as a vocalist when I didn't even know I could carry a tune until I was adopted. You have the voice of an angel, Kinley said dryly, and I croaked like a frog. Even Rose's laughter was lyrical, Kinley thought to herself. Rose had been like a breath of fresh air for Ben Michelson, a former rock star who'd enlisted and had come home critically injured. Despite their 8-year age gap, Rose and Ben were perfect together, both on stage and off. In fact, Rose had admitted that she'd had a crush on Ben as a teenager when he'd been a star. Although he'd been completely full of himself, as well as a womanizer before he'd suddenly enlisted and had seemed to disappear off the face of the earth, Rose and Ben had met again, falling for each other hard when he'd returned to Crystal Rock to make a comeback after surviving the loss of his leg in combat overseas. What does Ben think about becoming a father? Rose grimaced. Would you believe he doesn't know? That's why he's still on the road. I told him I wasn't feeling well, because actually I wasn't. He sent me home to rest up. I didn't find out I was pregnant until Mum suggested it, and I took a couple pregnancy tests and saw the doctor. Anyway, that's why we're spending the next week together alone in one of the cabins at Dragonfly Point. I wanted it to be special when I finally told Ben. Kinley smiled. That sounds perfect. Rose continued. Don't worry about the fact that Ben and I are having a second honeymoon. I forgot to tell you earlier that Dad's recruited some extra help for you. He'll be here for at least a week or two. He's on leave from the Air Force, but there's a chance he could be deployed at any time. If that happens, I'll come in if you need me. But apparently he has some experience training service dogs. Really? Kinley pursed her lips. It'd be nice to have some input about our new Wounded Warrior dog training programme from someone who's actually worked with the animals. That's exactly what I thought too, Rose admitted, especially since we're supposed to begin in the summer. But supposedly he'll be here tomorrow sometime. I'm sorry that I forgot to ask Dad his name. Dad's going to be letting him stay in one of the rental cabins that we use for the kids who attend Mum's music camp, though. Okay, I'll remember that, Kinley responded. I can see all the rental cabins from mine, so if the lights go on in one, I can't be worried. I can't wait to see the inside of your cabin, Rose murmured. Dad said it's really impressive. You'll have to come by sometime. Maybe I'll have a little get-together before Christmas when I'm more settled in. Kinley smiled widely. I'm really looking forward to Christmas this year, since I've had the cabin built. I decided to put aside the past because that's what my parents would want. It will be the first time I've celebrated the holidays since I've passed away. I can't believe how quickly you decided to build a house, Rose said. I think that Ben wants us to have our own house instead of living in Mum and Dad's guest house. It's worked out well when we've been touring, but we may want to stick closer to home because of the baby. So I can see Ben's point about having more privacy, especially when music camp is in session. My brothers and sisters are older now too, so they can more or less take care of themselves. I think you should probably have a home of your own. Babies can be tough. Even though you have a lot of family to babysit, there are going to be times for you two will need to escape from all the madness. For a moment, Kinley felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Christmas time was not only difficult because of the loss of her parents, but because of some other personal circumstances as well, namely breaking off the relationship with her boyfriend last year right before Thanksgiving. But Kinley had discovered she was much better off without Brent Phillips. Rose gave her an impish grin. I hear you. So tell me how you ended up deciding to settle down in Crystal Rock when you only intended to stick around for a year or two. The last time I saw you this summer, I was dropping you off at your apartment after Anna and Neil's wedding reception. When I came home last week, I was never more surprised to learn you'd built the cabin that was being built on the ridge overlooking the river, along Crystal Rock Lake. Dad said that you'd had them completely revamp the original plans because you wanted a much larger, pet-friendly home. It was after I asked to be in charge of the service animal programme. Your dad has done so much good with these no-kill shelters, which he's continued to set up throughout the country. And since this is going to be a pilot programme, I decided that if I was going to do it, I was going to give it my best shot. Besides, this is the first place I've lived since growing up in Alabama that's actually felt like home. There was a man in Montgomery, wasn't there? Kinley blinked. I guess I haven't exactly made it a secret. Rose studied her for a long, hard moment. I have a feeling there's more to it than that, but I can understand if you're not ready to talk about it. Yes, Kinley admitted. I'm still a little raw. But you can tell me about why you wanted such a big house. Dad mentioned you had an aviary built. Kinley laughed. Since it's a small town, I guess that everyone still knows more about me than I know about them. Dad had a thing for birds. We had a parrot named Lafayette who passed away a couple of years after Mum and Dad did. He was a pretty old and very sweet, but I could swear he died of grief. I was really attached to him, especially since both Mum and Dad had been, and it kind of broke my heart when he passed away too. Anyway, I got thinking about what I wanted in a forever home. I inherited quite a bit of money from my parents because Dad and Mum were always workaholics and I was an only child. If I was going to take on the job as full-time permanent vet in charge of the facility here, I decided I wanted to have the capability to care for animals at home if I needed to. Your dad and Mum warned me about the weather, and I knew we'd continue having interns feeding, watering and walking the animals. But if I'm on call, I don't want to necessarily be stuck here at the shelter all night and sleeping on one of the couches. I'd rather be in the comfort of my own home where I can stay rested at the same time. I'm sure this programme's going to keep me very busy, so I decided to have an extra heated space attached to the garage which could serve as an office in case of emergency. That's an excellent idea. Dad used to get called in here all the time before we had the extra help and interns we have now. Rose looked thoughtful. We do need more than just a break room here at the shelter. We have a lot of kids and teenagers working here part-time and it's fine for them. But the more full-time people Dad hires, the more he needs to be thinking about his vision of the future. He pretty much comes and goes he pleases, and you do all the scheduling, not to mention hiring and firing. I had to tell him that I think we needed an extra training space too, like an additional arena, maybe at the back of the property away from the shelter. It's important to keep the Warriors training programme separate from the programme for kids and adults with disabilities, to avoid confusion for the service animals. Training with them could end up being entirely different. That's something I never even thought of, although I'm sure Dad has, since he was deployed to Afghanistan with his own service animal. At first we all own the surrounding space. Rose grimaced. We'll have to go back into fundraising mode, though, if we need to add another facility.